You ever had one of those moments when you realize the people messing with you have absolutely no clue who they're dealing with? Well, that was me. Standing in front of my own house with two men dressed like cops' badges flashing. Hands on their belts, acting like they had authority, except I could tell within seconds that everything about them was fake. Before I tell you what happened next, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Sham Stories so you never miss another wild HOA tale like this. Because trust me, this one gets crazy. I had just moved into a quiet, upscale community called Oak Ridge Estates. The kind of neighborhood that looked perfect from the outside, trimmed hedges, clean driveways, friendly smiles, and a powerful homeowners association that controlled everything from the color of your shutters to how long your car could be parked on the curb. I dealt with plenty of HOA nonsense in my time, but I didn't expect this one to go to war with me. My name's Daniel Carter, and what they didn't know was that I wasn't just some new homeowner. I was the chief of police for the entire county. I kept my identity quiet when I moved in because I wanted peace, not politics. But the HOA president, a woman named Patricia Knox, known by everyone as Patty, didn't like new faces who didn't bow to her authority. The first issue started over something ridiculous. My mailbox. It was black instead of the regulation bronze. She left a note on my door, written in that passive-aggressive HOA tone. Please adhere to the community standards. This will be your only warning. I ignored it, thinking she'd get bored and move on. But Patty wasn't the kind to let things slide. Within days, she sent violation letters, fined me for supposed noncompliance, started showing up outside my house with her little clipboard and camera. I stayed polite, even friendly. But when she started snooping around my property, taking photos over the fence, I warned her once firmly that she was trespassing. I could have arrested her for harassment, but I wanted to keep things civil. That's when things escalated. A week later, I came home from a late night at the station and saw two SUVs parked at the end of my driveway. Out stepped two men in uniforms, patches that looked like sheriff's deputies at first glance. They flashed fake badges and said they were here on HOA authority to take me into custody for violation of community law. I stared at them, amused. Community law? I asked. That's not how it works, gentlemen. One of them, a tall, broad man with mirrored sunglasses, even though it was night, said, Sir, we need you to comply. You're under arrest by order of the Oak Ridge Estates Board. I almost laughed, but I played along. You got paperwork for that? I asked. He handed me a printout, official looking, with seals and signatures, but I could tell instantly it was fake. The arrest warrant had been signed by Patricia Knox herself, listing violations like visual disharmony and failure to comply with board orders. I folded the paper, put it in my pocket, and said calmly, Let me grab my jacket. When I stepped back inside, I called dispatch. Hey, it's Carter. Run a quick plate check for two black SUVs parked at 1120 Oak Ridge Lane. Also, send 2 real units my way. 5 minutes later, the imposters started to get nervous. Sir, we don't have all night, one said, smiled. You're right, you don't. The sound of sirens cut through the quiet neighborhood. The fake officers froze. I stepped forward, hands behind my back, watching as 2 marked cruisers turned the corner, lights flashing. Real deputies got out and ordered the fake ones to show ID. Within seconds, both men were on the ground, cuffed and confused. One of my sergeants approached me, realizing who I was. Chief Carter. What the hell is going on? I handed him the phony warrant. Looks like our HOA thinks they can issue arrest orders now. We found out later the 2 men were hired security guards. Patty had paid them through HOA funds to enforce compliance. She had told them I was a dangerous resident violating neighborhood peace. The next morning, news spread through the entire community that the new homeowner had gotten the HOA's enforcers arrested. Patty tried to spin the story, calling me a violent man who attacked HOA volunteers. She didn't realize who I was yet. I showed up at the next HOA meeting just to see how far she'd go. The conference room was packed, dozens of homeowners sitting on folding chairs, whispering. Patty sat at the head of the table, smug in her power suit. As you all know, she began, we had an unfortunate incident last night involving one of our residents who refused to follow community rules. I leaned back, arms crossed, letting her dig her own grave. We will be pressing charges and ensuring this individual faces consequences. That's when I stood up. Every head turned. Patty blinked, clearly surprised to see me. Daniel Carter, I said, Chief of Police, Oak County. The room went silent. You sent 2 fake officers to my home? They're in custody now. I suggest you get a lawyer. Patty's face turned pale, but she tried to recover. This is a misunderstanding, no, I interrupted. This is criminal impersonation, fraud, and misuse of HOA funds. You endangered public safety. The homeowners started murmuring, some even clapping. Patty's power crumbled right there. I could see fear in her eyes, but I knew this wasn't over. Someone like her didn't give up control easily. After the meeting, one of the neighbors, a quiet man named Mark, approached me. Chief, just be careful, he whispered. Patty has friends on the board, and they don't like losing. I nodded. I'd dealt with tougher people than HOA bullies, but something about the way he said it made me uneasy. That night, as I pulled into my driveway, I noticed something odd. My mailbox was gone again, ripped right out of the ground. A single note was taped to my door. You can't police us all. My instincts kicked in. This wasn't just about neighborhood politics anymore. It was personal. I grabbed my flashlight, scanning the yard. There were fresh tire tracks in the grass, footprints near the fence line, and the faint smell of gasoline in the air. Someone had been here, and they wanted to send a message. I went inside, locked the doors, and checked the security footage. The cameras had been disabled. That's when I knew Patty and her little group weren't done. They were planning something bigger, something dangerous. And they still didn't know just how far I was willing to go to protect what was mine. The next morning, I was up before sunrise, standing at the edge of my driveway with a cup of coffee, staring at the empty space where my mailbox used to be. The air felt heavy, thick with that kind of silence that comes right before a storm. I'd dealt with dangerous criminals, drug rings, and corruption in my career. But somehow this suburban power struggle with an HOA president was starting to feel more personal than any of that. My phone buzzed, Sergeant Hayes calling. Chief, the 2 impersonators confessed, he said. Said a woman named Patricia Knox hired them to arrest you and restore order. She paid them cash. We're verifying where it came from. I sighed, watching a couple of early joggers pass by, pretending not to notice the police tape still hanging on the corner of my fence. Get a warrant on the HOA's financial accounts, I said. And keep this quiet for now. I don't want a media circus, Hayes agreed, but I could tell from his tone that word was already spreading. That afternoon, as I drove to the station, a few of my officers gave me that look, the mix of respect and disbelief that said, Chief, how did an HOA manage to pick a fight with you? I smiled and brushed it off, but deep down, I knew this wasn't a laughing matter. Patricia wasn't acting alone. When I reviewed the case file, I saw something odd. The fake badges the imposters wore had been made by a company called Community Enforcement Solutions, registered to a man named Dennis Harper, Patty's vice president on the HOA board. I called in a favor from a contact in the county clerk's office and got Harper's file. Turns out he'd been a private investigator before losing his license for fraud. This wasn't amateur stuff. They'd built an entire fake enforcement system under the HOA's name. Later that night, I decided to take a quiet drive through the neighborhood. The streetlights flickered along the empty cul-de-sacs as I passed houses with perfect lawns and drawn curtains. I noticed how every home looked too quiet, too controlled. When I slowed near Patty's house, I saw her in the window, on the phone, pacing like she was running a crisis. I parked a few blocks away and walked back on foot, staying in the shadows. Through the open curtains, I could hear muffled voices, Patty and Dennis arguing. You said it would be handled, she hissed. Now the police are involved. He's the chief of police, Patty. What the hell did you expect me to do? Dennis barked back. You said he was just some homeowner. You never told me who he was. I leaned closer, my instincts razor sharp. Patty slammed something against the table. Then we'll make him leave another way, she snapped. We'll make his life so miserable, he'll pack up and sell. We control the neighborhood, remember? We'll hit him with violations, fines, social pressure, whatever it takes. Dennis sounded nervous. This isn't worth it, Patty. We should cut our losses. No, she said coldly. He humiliated me in front of everyone. I won't stop until he's gone. I stepped back quietly, realizing just how far she was willing to go. This wasn't about rules or authority, it was about ego and control. The next morning, the retaliation began. I got 3 new violation notices shoved into my mailbox, so correction into the hole where my mailbox used to be. Unauthorized lawn ornamentation, improper waste container visibility, non-approved exterior lighting, all nonsense. Patty was using every line of the HOA rulebook as a weapon. Neighbors who had smiled at me before suddenly looked the other way. Even the elderly woman across the street who used to wave every morning now shut her curtains when I stepped outside. I wasn't angry, I was disappointed. The fear Patty had over these people was remarkable. I knew I had to make a move before things got out of hand. At the station, I called my internal affairs liaison and explained what was going on off the record. Sounds like a civil issue, Chief, he said cautiously. But if HOA funds are involved in criminal impersonation, that's something else. Exactly what I was thinking. We got a judge to issue a warrant to seize the HOA's financial documents for audit. When my officers served it at the HOA office, Patty was there, smiling, acting innocent. But I could see the panic in her eyes when the deputies started boxing up records and computers. Is this really necessary, Chief Carter? She asked sweetly. We're just a neighborhood board. A neighborhood board doesn't hire fake cops, I replied flatly. If you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to worry about. She gave me that tight, fake smile. You'll regret this, Daniel. I leaned closer. That's Chief Carter to you. The audit revealed that thousands of dollars in community funds had been misused cash withdrawals, fake invoices, and suspicious security payments signed off by both Patty and Dennis. It was enough for embezzlement charges. But before we could make an arrest, the case took a strange turn. One evening, I got a call from dispatch. Patty had reported a home invasion at her residence. I drove there personally, thinking maybe someone had finally snapped and gone after her. But when I arrived, her house was fine, no broken windows, no forced entry, nothing. Patty stood in her doorway, pretending to be terrified, tears in her eyes. He's stalking me, she shouted, pointing at me in front of my own officers. That man, he's trying to destroy me. My officers froze, unsure what to do. Ma'am, that's Chief Carter, one of them said quietly. You called 911 on the chief? She broke down, sobbing, but I saw right through it. She was trying to create a record to paint me as a threat in case her crimes caught up with her. Patricia, I said calmly, you're wasting police resources. Again, you'll see, she snapped, regaining her composure. This isn't over. I left before I said something I'd regret, but later that night, someone slashed my tires. Then the next day, someone sprayed abuser in red paint across my fence. I had cameras reinstalled this time with hidden backup she wouldn't find. When I reviewed the footage, I saw exactly what I expected. Dennis himself, sneaking into my yard at 2 a.m., vandalizing my property like a coward. I called my officers, and by morning, he was in cuffs. When the news hit the neighborhood, everything changed again. Homeowners started whispering, realizing the people who had run their HOA were criminals. Patty, desperate, called an emergency board meeting to clear her name. I went to, not to talk, just to watch her fall apart. The boardroom was full again, but this time, people weren't clapping for her. They were angry. One woman stood up and said, "We trusted you, Patty. You used our money for fake police." For harassment? Patty tried to shout her down, but the noise grew. The residents were done being scared. I finally stepped forward, calm and firm. You can't bully people into obedience forever, I said. Some rules are meant to protect a community. Yours were meant to control it. That ends tonight. Patty's voice cracked as she screamed, "You think you can destroy me? I built this neighborhood." I looked her straight in the eye. "No, Patty, you poisoned it." Sheriff's deputies entered moments later, warrant in hand. I didn't have to say a word as they placed her under arrest. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for anyone to defend her, but nobody did. The woman who once controlled everything now looked small, cornered, and powerless. But something in her expression unsettled me a faint, satisfied smirk as they led her out in handcuffs. It was as if she knew something I didn't, as if she had one last card to play. That night, sitting alone in my office, I replayed the look she gave me. I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't finished. Patty Knox might have been in jail, but Oak Ridge Estates still had secret sand. I had just started uncovering them. After Patty's arrest, the neighborhood quieted for a while, but I could feel the unease humming beneath the calm. It's strange how quickly peace can feel unnatural when you've been fighting a battle for too long. People began mowing their lawns again. Kids played in the street. The board meetings were suspended until a new HOA leadership could be elected. For the first time, Oak Ridge Estates felt like an actual community, not a dictatorship. Still, I knew better than to relax completely. The way Patty smirked as she was led away kept replaying in my mind. It wasn't the look of someone who had lost. It was the look of someone who knew the next move had already been set in motion. 2 weeks later, I found out just how right I was. One Friday evening, as I was preparing to leave the station, my deputy, Hayes, walked in, looking uneasy. "Chief, you'll want to see this," he said, handing me a folder. Inside were photo surveillance stills of men meeting in a dark parking lot downtown. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual, until I spotted Dennis Harper in one of the images, the same man we'd arrested for vandalizing my property. "He made bail?" I asked sharply. "Yesterday morning," Hayes said. "And it gets better. The guy he's meeting with? Former county inspector named Richard Vaughn. Guess who signed off on all the HOA's fake permits?" I clenched my jaw, realizing the web was bigger than I thought. Vaughn had worked under the county development office for years and had been quietly dismissed for bribery. ALLEGATIONS. That never stuck. If Patty and Dennis were working with him, they weren't just running HOA scams, they were building something bigger, maybe even using HOA money to launder funds. I told Hayes to keep it under wraps and start digging discreetly. That night I couldn't sleep. I went for a walk through the neighborhood, hoping the quiet might settle my thoughts. The air was thick, humid, the kind that makes everything feel heavier. I passed houses with lights off, blinds drawn tight, and for a second, I felt like the only person awake in the entire community. That's when I noticed a dark SUV idling 2 houses down from mine. Its headlights were off, but the faint glow from the dashboard gave away a silhouette inside. I reached for my phone, snapped a quick picture, and stepped into the open streetlight so whoever was inside could see me clearly. The SUV's engine roared, and it sped off. I chased it on foot long enough to catch the license plate. By the time I got home, I ran it through our system. It came back registered to a shell company called Oak Ridge Property Solutions, another HOA subsidiary created under Patty's leadership months before her arrest. The woman was in custody, yet her network was still active. I didn't tell anyone at first. The last thing I needed was panic among residents or the press sniffing around. Instead, I gathered my own quiet evidence recordings, financial records, emails I subpoenaed through the court, and slowly, the picture started to form. Patty's group had been funneling HOA fees into private accounts, paying contractors that didn't exist. Some of that money ended up funding a community safety initiative, which in reality was a security outfit that acted like their own personal police force. That's where the fake officers came from. But the deeper I went, the darker it got. A week later, one of my detectives came into my office with a grim look. "Chief, you should see this," he said, placing a printed email on my desk. It was from a county server time-stamped 3 months earlier before I'd even moved in. The email was between Patty and Vaughn, discussing the sale of an undeveloped lot behind Oak Ridge Estates. Land that wasn't legally part of the HOA, but somehow had been acquired under false pretenses. My heart sank when I realized what that meant. That land bordered a small stream that connected directly to the city's water runoff system. If they had done any illegal dumping or construction there, it could contaminate the whole zone. "Get an environmental team on site tomorrow," I ordered. "I want that property searched from top to bottom." When the results came back, my worst fears were confirmed. There were buried drums of industrial waste paint solvents, chemicals, even traces of gasoline. Someone had been hiding evidence of illegal dumping for years. Patty's HOA wasn't just about control or money, they were covering up environmental crimes. And half the county offices had been paid to look the other way. The moment that report hit my desk, I knew things were going to explode. The next morning, the story leaked to the press. Cameras flooded Oak Ridge Estates, reporters camping outside the gates, asking how a suburban HOA could be connected to criminal activity and environmental violations. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. The mayor wanted answers. The county board wanted a statement. And my own officers were stretched thin keeping the peace. But beneath all that chaos, one detail stood out. Patty had somehow made bail, released under medical review, and was now under house arrest pending trial. The smirk she'd given me suddenly made sense. I drove out to her property under surveillance, of course, but she was still there, sitting on her porch, looking relaxed. "You don't know when to quit, do you, Daniel?" she said as I approached. I crossed my arms. "I thought jail time might have humbled you." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "You really think I was working alone? You think Oak Ridge exists just to annoy you? This neighborhood was a project, a model for private authority. We were building something the county couldn't control. You built a criminal enterprise," I shot back, "and you're going to prison for it." She leaned forward, her voice dropping. "You're a cop, Daniel. You should know better. The system protects people like me. The board will replace me. The money will keep flowing, and you'll be left with nothing but headlines." I didn't respond, but something inside me burned. I'd seen corruption before, but never so smugly packaged behind a smile and a garden gate. When I left her property, I noticed a man standing by the corner, pretending to check his phone. He wasn't from the neighborhood. I knew every face here by now. I caught his reflection in my side mirror as I drove off, and sure enough, he followed me out. I didn't head home. Instead, I circled around the next street and pulled into a dark side road, watching as his car crept past. I tailed him all the way to a warehouse near the industrial district, the same one listed on the permit paperwork, under Oak Ridge Property Solutions. That night, I called Hayes and a small tactical team. We raided the warehouse before dawn, and what we found was staggering. Boxes of fake badges, uniforms, counterfeit documents, even police radio scanners, all part of the same operation that had targeted me weeks earlier. But that wasn't all. Hidden in one of the back rooms was a filing cabinet filled with HOA records personal data on every resident in Oak Ridge Estates. Addresses, income details, credit scores, even background checks. They'd been spying on everyone, gathering leverage to keep them compliant. Hayes looked at me, shaking his head. "This is bigger than an HOA, Chief. This is organized crime." The deeper we dug, the clearer it became that Patty's HOA had been a front for a much larger network that extended beyond Oak Ridge. Multiple communities run by the same management firm, each one funneling money through fake maintenance projects and security contracts. I stared at the files, realizing this wasn't about a woman's ego anymore. It was about power, control built on fear. When we seized the evidence, I knew we had enough to shut them down, but I also knew the fight wasn't over. That night, as I returned home, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I answered, and a distorted voice came through. "You should have left it alone, Chief. Oak Ridge was just the beginning." The line went dead. I looked out my window at the quiet streets, the perfect houses, the soft glow of porch lights, and for the first time, I wondered if peace would ever return here, or if the entire neighborhood was built on lies too deep to undo. After that phone call, sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. I sat in my living room for hours, lights off, staring through the window blinds at the still perfect streets of Oak Ridge Estates. Every trimmed hedge and spotless driveway suddenly looked suspicious, like the neighborhood itself was watching me. I had dealt with cartels, corrupt officials, and violent offenders, but this was a different kind of evil. It hid behind laws, signatures, and the illusion of civility. I poured myself another cup of black coffee and replayed the voice on the phone in my head. Oak Ridge was just the beginning. Those words looped endlessly in my thoughts. I called Hayes early the next morning and told him to meet me at the station. When he arrived, I had the evidence from the warehouse spread across the conference table, boxes of fake IDs, contracts, and data disks. "Whoever's behind this network," I said, "isn't just running HOAs. They're building private governance structures neighborhoods where they control the police, fines, the money, everything. Hayes leaned back, rubbing his temples. You're saying this is some kind of shadow government? More like a corporate one, I replied. They use HOA bylaws to take control of communities, then manipulate residents into compliance. It's brilliant in a terrifying way. We started tracing the shell companies tied to Oak Ridge Property Solutions. Each led to another, like a spider web stretching across the states and ridge management. Greenleaf Holdings, Crestview, Community Services all registered under fake names, all moving money between each other. But the trail always circled back to one name buried deep in the paperwork, a consulting firm called Nexus Development Partners. According to state records, Nexus handled community infrastructure investments. But when I ran a search on their directors, only one active officer remained listed, a man named Richard Vaughn, the same ex-county inspector who'd met Dennis Harper in that parking lot. That connection was all the proof I needed. I put together a joint task force, our department, county sheriff's office, and a few trusted feds I'd worked with before. We launched an undercover investigation into Nexus, using Oak Ridge as the starting point. Weeks passed in a blur of long nights, surveillance operations, and endless paperwork. Meanwhile, the tension inside Oak Ridge was building again. Without the HOA officially operating, residents were divided. Some wanted to rebuild the board with fresh leadership. Others wanted to dissolve it completely. The neighborhood Facebook group became a war zone of arguments and accusations. And in the middle of it all, strange things started happening again. Mailboxes were tampered with. Security cameras were smashed. Someone slashed tires on my cruiser one night while it sat parked in front of my house. I knew these weren't random acts. Patty's loyalists were still out there, doing her dirty work. One evening, I came home to find an envelope taped to my door, no name, no stamp. Inside was a single photo. It was of me, sitting in my living room, taken through my window blinds. Underneath, scrawled in black marker, were the words, "We see you too." I froze for a second, feeling the weight of the silence around me. My dog, a German shepherd named Duke, started barking wildly toward the fence. I grabbed my flashlight and gun and stepped outside, scanning the yard. The bushes rustled, but by the time I reached the corner, whoever was there was gone. Only footprints remained, large, boot-shaped prints heading toward the back gate. That night, I installed new motion sensors and floodlights, then checked the backup footage for my hidden cameras. What I saw made my stomach tighten. 3 figures dressed in dark clothes had entered my yard at 2:47 a.m. They moved with precision, one disabling the main camera, one searching the back porch, and another standing watch near the driveway. They were in and out in less than 2 minutes, but it was clear they knew exactly what they were doing. The next morning, I analyzed the footage frame by frame with Hayes. See that? I pointed to the patch on one man's shoulder. It was blurry, but visible enough, a circular logo with the letters NDP. Nexus Development Partners, I said. They're not hiding anymore. Hayes frowned. You think they're trying to intimidate you? No, I said quietly. They're trying to remind me that I'm being watched. We decided to move on Nexus immediately. Using the evidence from Oak Ridge and the warehouse, we obtained a warrant for their main office downtown. The raid took place 3 days later. My team and I entered the glass high-rise at dawn, moving swiftly through polished hallways lined with awards and motivational posters. When we reached the top floor, the receptionist panicked at the sight of badges and guns. "You can't just barge in here," she cried. "We have rights." "So do the people you've been exploiting," I said, pushing open the double doors to the executive suite. What we found inside was a scene straight out of a corporate thriller, computers still running, servers uploading files, shredders humming with half-destroyed documents spilling out. It was chaos. But we caught Vaughn himself trying to sneak out through a side exit. He froze when he saw me. "Chief Carter," he said with a smirk, as if we were old friends, "you really don't know when to stop digging, do you? You're under arrest for fraud, money laundering, and obstruction of justice," I said, cuffing him myself. He laughed quietly. "You think you're winning, but you're just cutting one head off a hydra. There are dozens more HOAs like Oak Ridge, Chief. You can't stop them all. We seized their records, their hard drives, and their bank accounts, uncovering evidence that tied them to multiple communities across the state. The operation was massive, spanning millions of dollars in fraudulent activity. But something still bothered me. None of the data showed direct communication from Patty while she was in custody. She wasn't just a pawn, she'd been part of the leadership. That night, as I sat in my office reviewing reports, Hayes came in holding a manila envelope. "Chief, this came through internal mail. No sender listed." Inside was a small flash drive. I plugged it in carefully, isolated from the network. A single video file appeared, timestamped just hours earlier. The footage showed Patty in her living room, still under house arrest, sitting calmly as if waiting for someone. A distorted voice spoke from off-camera. "You did well, Patricia. Oak Ridge served its purpose. The project will continue." Patty nodded, smiling faintly. "And Carter." The voice chuckled. "He's useful. Let him think he's winning. We'll adapt." Then the video cut off. My pulse quickened as I replayed it twice. This wasn't just an HOA gone rogue. This was a coordinated test run, and I had just exposed their prototype. The next day, before I could act, Patty was found dead in her home. Officially ruled a heart attack, but everything about it smelled wrong. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, just a perfectly clean scene. To clean. Hayes looked at me across the autopsy report. "You think they silenced her?" "No," I said grimly. "They retired her." For the next few days, I couldn't shake the thought that I was being watched again. The SUV returned twice, parked further down the street this time. My phone glitched during calls. My security cameras occasionally went offline for minutes at a time. I filed an official federal request for surveillance assistance. But I already knew whoever was behind this had resources that went beyond local jurisdiction. One evening, I came home to find Duke barking hysterically at the front gate again. I stepped outside, gun drawn, and found a small drone hovering above the yard. It darted upward the moment I aimed at it, disappearing into the night. I retrieved its remains an hour later after it crashed a few blocks away. It had a serial number linking it to a private security firm based out of another, Nexus Associated Community Esbridge Gardens. The pattern was undeniable. These people weren't just building neighborhoods. They were constructing networks of private intelligence. HOA by name, surveillance state by design. And somehow, I had become their most dangerous enemy simply by existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. I looked out my window at Oak Ridge that night, still silent. Deceptively perfect hand swore to myself that no matter how deep this thing went, I was going to burn every last piece of it to the ground. After the drone incident, everything sped up in a way that made my hands tremble when I thought about how many pieces were still moving against me. And I realized that subtlety had been wasted. This was a full-on war, and skirmishes were happening on every front at once. So I stopped pretending I could handle it alone and called in favors I'd earned over 25 years on the job, bringing in a small, tight federal team to help piece together the network while keeping the county out of the loop to avoid leaks. And we set up a secure command center in an unused evidence room at the precinct where the blinds were always drawn and the coffee machine never stopped humming. Because there was no time to be polite about it, Nexus and its subsidiaries were more organized than any criminal enterprise I'd dismantled before. And that meant they had contingencies for every inconvenience, including the disappearance of their front people. Our forensic accountants followed the money across state lines and into shell accounts that emptied into hard assets properties, private equity funds, a luxury escrow tucked under the name of a company registered in a privacy state, and every name on that paper trail had layers of nominees between it and the real directors. But when we cross-reference expenses with the HOA ledgers from Oak Ridge, we started to see patterns, payments for community safety, that matched invoices from private security companies tied to Nexus, land improvement contracts that routed to companies that existed only on paper, and travel expenses that led to meetings at conference centers across the country where Nexus representatives gave presentations on community governance efficiency to their audience. Sounded like a business seminar, and to me, Sounded like an indoctrination program for people who wanted to privatize enforcement and accountability. And once that model took hold in enough suburbs, it would be nearly impossible to pry out because residents traded civil liberties for the promise of a pristine neighborhood and a higher resale value. While the money people worked their ledgers, my tactical people worked the ground, conducting undercover surveillance in 3 other developments linked to Nexus, and what we found was chilling. Neighborhood watch groups that carried paramilitary gear, private patrols with unmarked radios and intimidating demeanors, and local boards that were less concerned with bylaw infractions and more with maintaining a climate of fear. So residents would sign off on policies without asking questions. And in each place we found the same playbook: financial manipulation, selective enforcement, and a core group of consultants who trained the local leaders on how to handle dissent, often by creating scandals, false reports, or social pressure. And yet, even with our mounting pile of evidence, the more I clawed at their structure, the more I realized they had infiltrated places I thought were sacrosanct, including county departments and private firms that did business with municipalities, and that explained why Vaughn had once been untouchable and why Patty had been so confident even after her arrest she'd been a small but useful node in a much larger ecosystem, and killing her would not kill the network. As the federal team dug, some of my most trusted deputies went undercover posing as consultants and homeowners, attending private dinners where Nexus operatives taught tactics for community cohesion, a euphemism that always ended in a recommendation for heavy-handed enforcement and an outline of ways to financially benefit the board. And at one dinner, an operative casually mentioned a name I didn't expect to hear: Elliot Marsh, a quiet philanthropist who donated seed money to community projects and whose foundation oddly held controlling interest in several management firms. Elliot's name popped up in corporate filings and charitable disbursement reports, always one layer removed and always in amounts that looked clean on the surface. But the pattern was there. Elliot's foundation funneled money into Nexus projects right as those developments started to implement tougher enforcement regimes and questionable contracts. And when I ran Elliot's background, I discovered he'd once been a venture capitalist with a taste for real estate and an obsession with building ideal communities. He had charisma, polish, and a genuine philanthropic veneer that made him almost untouchable in high society. And yet in private, he'd been pushing a theory of managed social environments that slipped into dangerous territory when applied at scale as presentations. 2 private development forums argued for integrated control of infrastructure, legal frameworks, and community standards so that undesirable volatility could be eliminated. And those words, when translated into action, meant removing dissenters, suppressing inconvenient information, and monetizing the governance process. Once Elliot's name was on the table, everything made sense. Nexus had funding, political cover through strategic donations to local officials, and an ideology that made the operation feel righteous to those who bought into it. We tightened our net, building a case that tied financial records from Nexus to payments routed through Elliot's foundation, and then through an unbroken chain to the shell companies that had paid for the fake officers, the warehouse, and the drone fleet. But just as the walls closed in, something happened that reminded me this fight would cost more than arrests, and indictment sit would cost people's sense of safety, possibly more. One late afternoon, my wife, Laura, called from home sounding strained. She'd been fielding odd visits from neighbors who asked questions in the doorway. People I didn't recognize who wanted to check on the chief's family. A landscaper who'd photographed the back of our house for maintenance records, details Laura found suspicious. And though she tried to laugh it off, I heard fear in her voice for the first time in 20 years of marriage, which made my stomach drop because you can compartmentalize danger at work, but not when it follows you through your front door. So I arranged for a protective detail around our house and told Laura to sleep at her sister's for a few nights until we sorted this out. But the next morning, the protective detail found the sister's mailbox had been opened, and a single photograph left inside a picture of Laura, taken from a distance, with our daughter Emma. In the background at school pickup, and scrawled across the bottom in black marker, were 3 words: back off. Chief, which was the first time this stopped being about me and started being about the people I loved. Rage and a cold, practical fear burned through me in equal measure. And instead of acting wildly, I set a trap. We staged a decoy. Laura and Emma left town under the pretense of her relatives' visit while I kept a smaller, more covert detail posted and fed our intelligence people false patterns about my movements. And then we baited a meeting by planting a credible tip about a supposed financial transfer from Nexus to a shell account, knowing that someone in their circle would act to protect the money or retrieve a document. And sure enough, a courier showed up at a wire transfer office downtown the next evening with a time-sensitive package that the Nexus people considered priceless. So we followed him, cars trailing him like ghosts until he met at a discreet loading dock with 2 men and a woman who moved with practiced anonymity. And when we moved in, it was frenzied. Badges flashed, hands grabbed, curses flew. And in the struggle, the woman pulled a small pistol and fired once. Not at an officer, but at a ceiling tile, to create chaos and distraction. And in that confusion, the courier pushed into the shadows with a briefcase and vanished into a maze of alleys before we could close the net. But in the seizure room, the woman we cuffed was not a low-level henchman. She was impeccably dressed, mid-40s, with a look of cold efficiency that screamed corporate operator. And when we read her ID, it was linked to a private intelligence firm that had been hired by multiple HOA management companies. The same firm that subcontracted surveillance for Nexus projects, which meant the operation had a private security arm with professional tradecraft drones, sleeper cells, and a willingness to cross legal lines for plausible deniability. The woman refused to talk at first, but federal interrogation tactics and the weight of evidence brought her to a breaking point. And in a quiet moment, she gave us a line that made the room go still. "You're playing checkers, Chief. They're playing chess. Elliot funds the board. Nexus builds the playbook. We execute the strategy, and then someone like Patricia tests the perimeter. You ruin their demonstration, so they'll pivot. Expect things to escalate, and expect them to go after what you care about most to send a message." I sat back and let that settle in. It confirmed everything I'd feared, that Oak Ridge was the prototype and I'd become the inconvenient variable, and if they were willing to increase the stakes against me personally, then our legal wins could be Pyrrhic if the collateral damage grew too large. So I had to balance the urge to retaliate with the duty to protect, which is a hard calculus when your instinct is to charge the field alone. We tightened witness protection, moved Laura and Emma to a safe house under federal supervision, and accelerated grand jury proceedings to freeze assets before Nexus could disappear with the money. And for a brief, rare moment, there was progress. Key accounts were frozen, servers seized, and the press had a feeding frenzy that finally put the scope of the scheme on the record. But with every successful move, their retaliations grew more targeted and experimental sabotage, psychological intimidation, and legal. When dawn crept over the city after the raids, the sky was a bruised gray that looked like it hadn't decided whether to clear or collapse. And that indecision mirrored everything inside me. The headlines screamed victory, police chief dismantles, nationwide HOA corruption ring, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd only taken down a branch of something Hydra-like, ready to grow back smarter, quieter, and more dangerous. The arrests were clean, the evidence overwhelming, and Elliot Marsh's smug calmness during his booking had already become meme material online. Yet underneath all the noise, I felt the vibration of something moving, plans pivoting, orders rerouting, systems recalibrating. Nexus had been too sophisticated, too patient to have bet everything on one figurehead in one network. That morning, while the world celebrated, I sat at my desk reading through every intercepted transmission we'd pulled from their servers. Hidden within thousands of lines of coded correspondence was a recurring file reference. Continuity Project, Phase 3. The phrase appeared innocuous, tucked between routine operational reports, but the timestamps were dated after the raids, meaning someone somewhere was still issuing commands. We tracked the digital breadcrumbs through a chain of proxy servers and offshore accounts until one of our analysts, traced a fresh login to a server farm in Nevada, buried inside an energy research firm that, unsurprisingly, was another Nexus subsidiary. Hayes looked at me across the war room table and said what we were both thinking. They're still live. I didn't ask for backup. We moved that night, quiet and off the books. A convoy of unmarked SUVs rolled through the desert, headlights off, guided by GPS and adrenaline. The facility was minimalist, concrete, and steel, sitting in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by motion sensors and automated gates. I flashed my badge at the camera, even though I knew it wouldn't matter. The system didn't care about authority. It cared about access. When the gate didn't move, Hayes cut the power manually. We breached through the side maintenance entrance, flashlights slicing through a maze of empty corridors. The deeper we went, the more surreal it became. Rows of humming servers, a faint chemical smell, and security cameras that followed us even without power. We reached the central control room and found what we hadn't expected, a group of 6 people sitting calmly at computer terminals, all wearing gray Nexus polos, as if waiting for us, one of them. A young woman with sharp eyes and no trace of fear looked up from her screen. "You're too late," she said simply. I ordered everyone down, secured the room, and had our tech team pull the drives. But when we checked the server logs, we realized she hadn't been bluffing. The continuity project had already been activated. The files weren't just data, they were command packages uploaded to partner HOA systems across multiple states. Each one contained algorithms capable of autonomous management, self-learning, enforcement protocols that no longer required human oversight. In short, Nexus had automated itself. The code would continue to run, updating local boards, issuing citations, proving contracts, and maintaining the illusion of governance while funneling revenue to encrypted accounts. We could shut down one facility, one database, one office, but unless we located every node, it would keep regenerating like digital DNA. For a long moment, no one spoke. Hayes finally broke the silence. They turned HOAs into machines. Chief. Machines that don't care who's in charge. We confiscated everything's servers, terminals, and even the personal devices of the staff, but none of them resisted. It was as if they knew the outcome didn't matter. On the drive back, the desert stretched endlessly on both sides, all silent, except for the hum of the engine and the wind slipping through the cracks. I couldn't stop thinking about Elliot Marsh's words, "You can't arrest an idea." He'd been right in a way that made my skin crawl. What we'd been fighting wasn't a company or even a conspiracy. It was an ideology wrapped in technology. Nexus had built something self-sustaining, control without conscience, order without oversight. The next day, I briefed Monroe at the federal field office, laying everything out. He listened without interrupting, then leaned back and said, "You understand what this means, don't you? Even if we take down the systems, homeowners will protest. They'll demand them back. They like feeling safe, even if it's fake." That was the hardest truth to swallow. People would choose the cage if it was comfortable enough. Within a week, Elliot Marsh's lawyers filed motions claiming unlawful detention and suppression of innovation, arguing that Nexus had pioneered a civic management platform misunderstood by outdated authorities. Media outlets, hungry for controversy, ran sympathetic pieces framing him as a visionary wronged by bureaucracy. My inbox overflowed with hate mail and death threats, some from homeowners who thought I destroyed their community protections. Politicians wavered, donors withdrew, and within a month, the investigation's funding was under review. It was infuriating to watch public opinion bend toward the illusion of order again, and I realized the final battle wouldn't be in courtrooms or server rooms. It would be in the minds of the people who had willingly traded freedom for convenience. That was something I couldn't fight with a badge. Still, I wasn't ready to give up. Hayes and I started compiling a complete dossier, a narrative backed by evidence, showing how Nexus had evolved from HOA bureaucracy into a privatized enforcement system manipulating homeowners through fear and automation. We released it to independent journalists, bypassing official channels. The story exploded online. Leaked emails, surveillance footage, financial records, all laid bare for the world to see. Overnight, Nexus went from misunderstood innovator to national scandal. Congressional hearings were called. Elliot Marsh was subpoenaed. For the first time, it felt like the tide was turning. But victory is never clean. 3 days before his hearing, Elliot was found dead in his holding cell. Official cause, suicide. Unofficially, no one believed it. The surveillance camera outside his cell had mysteriously gone offline 10 minutes before his death. The message was clear: someone still powerful was cleaning up loose ends. The fallout was immediate. Nexus's parent entities dissolved under regulatory pressure, their assets scattered to ghost corporations abroad. But even as the dust settled, strange anomalies began to surface in communities across the country. Aided emails from non-existent HOA boards. Digital citations issued by compliance systems. Homeowners locked out of their accounts when they questioned fees. When we traced the IP addresses, they led nowhere familiar. The code had survived. Somewhere in the invisible architecture of the internet, the continuity project was still running. And maybe that was the point. Nexus didn't need people anymore. It had built a system that perpetuated itself, fueled by every rule-loving, control-hungry HOA that still existed. Months passed. The city moved on, or pretended to. My department commended me, the governor issued statements, and Oak Ridge slowly began to resemble a normal community again. Laura and Emma came home. We tried to live quietly, but I'd catch myself staring at the mailbox, half expecting another anonymous envelope. One evening, as I was closing the blinds, I saw a new family moving into the house across the street. They waved. I waved back. A shiny white SUV sat in their driveway, its license plate frame embossed with the words, "Managed by Harmony Living Solutions." I froze. That name hadn't appeared in any of our databases, but I recognized the font, the design, the Nexus branding reimagined. I pulled out my phone, ran a quick search, and my heart sank. Harmony Living Solutions, an innovative HOA management platform designed to integrate safety, automation, and peace of mind. It was the same system, reborn under a new name, already advertising in multiple states. The machine had rebooted itself while we were busy patting ourselves on the back. That night, I stood in the driveway staring at that glowing SUV logo, wondering how long before the same quiet tyranny crept back into every cul-de-sac and gated community in America. Maybe this was always inevitable. People would keep building walls, keep electing systems to enforce them, and someone, somewhere, would keep finding ways to profit from it. I thought about retiring then, walking away from the uniform, the badge, the endless cycle of corruption reinventing itself. But deep down, I knew I couldn't. I'd seen too much. Exposing Nexus had been the first step, not the last. There were others like them, waiting for their turn to rewrite the rules. And as long as I wore the title of Chief of Police, I wasn't about to let that happen again. So I went back inside, poured a cup of coffee, and opened a new case file on my laptop. The title was simple: Harmony Living Investigation. Because evil doesn't vanish, it rebrands. And every time it does, someone has to be willing to stand in the doorway and say, "Not this time." If you've followed this story all the way to the end, then you understand what power really looks like, when it hides behind good intentions. Don't let your freedom be managed by someone else's system. Stay alert, stay aware, and never let fear sell you control. And if you want to hear more true stories about how people fight back against corruption like this, make sure you subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel, because the next story I tell might just be the one happening in your own neighborhood. The following week felt like walking through a minefield, where every step could detonate something you couldn't see, but could almost hear ticking beneath the surface. And every time my phone buzzed, I expected it to be another threat, another breach, another reminder that the people I was up against weren't improvising. They were following a plan written years ago. The accelerant samples confirmed our fears. Nexus had relocated the hazardous drums to several other developments under construction across the county, embedding them near water mains and electrical infrastructure where one accident could wipe out half a neighborhood. They weren't storing evidence, they were planting leverage. I pulled together a task force of hazmat, FBI counter-tour, and local environmental investigators, ordering complete lockdowns on those sites before the press got wind of it. Even then, the operation had to be covert. If Nexus realized we knew, they'd move faster, cover deeper, or trigger one of the sites to destroy proof. For 48 hours, my world shrank to a blur of secure calls, emergency warrants, and sleepless hours staring at maps with red pins marking potential disaster zones, all while trying to keep my team from falling apart under pressure. Hayes, who had been my rock through everything, looked pale and hollow-eyed, muttering about how this had gone from a corruption probe to a national security nightmare. I told him to take a break, but he refused. "They came after your family, Chief," he said quietly. "They won't stop there. They'll go after everyone who stands between them and silence." He was right. And when I looked at the scope of what we were dealing with, I realized the line between HOA mismanagement and organized domestic sabotage had completely vanished. This wasn't about rules or property values. It was about control, absolute and engineered. That night, I drove alone through Oak Ridge, past the houses that looked so peaceful under the porch lights. The kind of neighborhood you'd never imagine being a battleground. But I knew better now. Every mailbox, every car in a driveway, every security camera could be part of a web woven by people who believed they were saving the world from chaos. The deeper we dug, the clearer it became that Nexus wasn't just an Oak Ridge, it was expanding. Licensing its community management systems to developments across 5 states, embedding private enforcement units and proprietary surveillance under the guise of smart neighborhood technology. It made me sick to think of all the families signing contracts that gave away their privacy. Believing they were joining a safe community, I pulled up outside the old HOA. Clubhouse still technically a crime scene, and walked inside with my flashlight cutting through the stale air. The walls still bore the marks of our raid weeks ago, scuffed paint, empty filing cabinets, but behind one cabinet, hidden by a false panel we'd somehow missed before, I found a small access port wired into the electrical junction box. When I pried it open, a tiny black device blinked once before going dark, a data tap, still warm. Someone had been remotely siphoning information long after the board had been arrested. I took it straight to evidence. The tech team worked overnight decoding the encrypted transmissions. What they found chilled me to the core. The device had been uploading HOA meeting notes, property transaction logs, and law enforcement communications, specifically anything referencing me or the Oak Ridge investigation. The last data packet had been transmitted 2 days earlier to a relay server in Washington, D.C., registered under yet another Nexus shell. That meant someone at the federal level, either complicit or oblivious, was providing cover. I didn't sleep at all that night. I called our federal liaison, Special Agent Monroe, and told him everything. He went quiet for a long time, then said, "Chief, if you're right, this goes way above my clearance. But if you're wrong, and you go public too soon, you'll get discredited before the truth lands." It wasn't what I wanted to hear, but it was the truth. We needed proof that couldn't be buried, and we needed to bring it out at once, or we'd be destroyed piecemeal. The next day, one of our undercover officers, embedded in a Nexus run, HOA, texted a single coded message. "Stage 2 begins Friday." That was all. We decoded it through their training manuals. Stage 2 meant they were about to trigger a public correction and orchestrated incident designed to prove their system's necessity. In short, they were going to create chaos, then arrive as saviors. The question was where. We only had 72 hours. I called every officer, every contact, every analyst I could trust, and we built a predictive model based on their asset distribution and local chatter. One pattern stood out: a new residential complex still under partial construction 15 miles away. It's owned by a Nexus subsidiary and scheduled to host its first community open house that weekend. Thousands of people were expected to attend. The perfect target. We immediately deployed surveillance drones of our own, hidden teams, and undercover techs in the crowd. The morning of the event was uncomfortably clear, the kind of blue sky that made the whole thing seem unreal. Families streamed in with kids and strollers, music played over speakers, the air smelled like fresh paint and barbecue smoke. You wouldn't have known half the people there were law enforcement in plain clothes. I stayed in the command vehicle, headset crackling with chatter. "North entrance clear. Vendor zone stable. Possible signal interference near stage. Then, all at once, a static burst cut through our frequencies, and one of our drones went offline. I saw it in real time, a feed of the crowd freezing, then glitching into black. "They're jamming us," my tech officer said. A second drone died. Then a third. Seconds later, a plume of smoke erupted near the central fountain, followed by screams. It wasn't an explosion, more like a controlled release of something. My first thought was chemical. I shouted orders into the mic. "Evacuate the West Quadrant, lock down perimeter, medical teams up front now." My officers moved fast, corralling terrified families as panic rippled through the plaza. Through binoculars, I saw a group of men in dark polo shirts moving with deliberate calm toward the smoke too calm to be civilians. They carried canisters marked with safety decals, pretending to be hazmat responders. One of them wore an earpiece. That's when I realized this was the public correction. They'd planted a harmless but frightening chemical. Something that would make people cough and panic, but not kill them. And then their operatives would contain the incident, proving Nexus's system worked while making law enforcement look incompetent. It was psychological warfare disguised as community service. I radioed Hayes. "Target the fake responders' non-lethal takedown." Within seconds, our plainclothes officers surrounded them. Chaos erupted as one of the Nexus men pulled a stun baton, but Hayes tackled him before he could use it. The others scattered, vanishing into the smoke. By the time we regained control, 2 of our drones were recovered, but 3 had vanished, stolen in the confusion. The aftermath was pandemonium. Media helicopters buzzed overhead, filming everything. Local reporters screamed questions about whether law enforcement had mishandled the event. Within an hour, social media was flooded with edited clips that made it look like police had attacked innocent safety workers. Nexus's PR team worked faster than we could release statements. Within hours, hashtags calling for my resignation were trending. My phone rang nonstop. City officials, the mayor, even the governor's office demanding explanations. I wanted to shout that the safety workers were hired saboteurs. But until we had the stolen drones recovered, all I had was my word against Nexus's polished narrative. That night I sat in the dark of my office, exhausted and furious. Hayes came in quietly and set a file on my desk, a dossier, with photographs of the operatives we'd arrested. "We ID'd them," he said. "Former military contractors. Worked for private security firms funded by, you guessed it, Telliot Marsh's foundation." I stared at their faces, each one a ghost of a truth buried under layers of legality. "They won't stop," I said finally. "They'll keep escalating until they win or get exposed." Hayes nodded. "Then we exposed them." That's when I made the decision that would define the rest of my career. I authorized a full-scale joint operation between our department, federal agents, and environmental task forces to raid every Nexus facility in the state simultaneously, seizing assets, freezing accounts, and arresting anyone involved in the operation. It was reckless, borderline insubordination. But I knew waiting meant giving them another chance to rewrite the story. For 2 days we planned in silence, moving like shadows through bureaucracy. And then, just before dawn on a Thursday, we struck. Helicopters thundered over the industrial park where Nexus's main logistics hub operated. SWAT teams breached doors, shouting commands. The scene was chaos: servers ripped from racks, flash drives scattered, panicked techs handcuffed against walls. In one secured office we found Elliot Marsh himself, calm, collected, sipping coffee like he'd been waiting for us. He didn't resist. "You finally caught up?" he said with a faint smile. "But you still don't understand what you've done." I told him his operation was finished, that we had everything. He only chuckled. "You can't arrest an idea, Chief." The words stuck with me long after they cuffed him and let him out, because deep down, I feared he might be right. By nightfall, news of the raids broke nationwide. Commentators debated whether Nexus was a conspiracy or a misund.